Well, one of the biggest cases taken by the Competition Commission in the past year looked into the potential non-compliance of the BEE Act and alleged fronting. Some BE experts have argued there's a lack of understanding and management of the regulatory landscape under the current legislation. We're joined now to discuss that by Chris Rayner, who is an associate at Bravura Capital, joins us from our studios in Cape Town. Chris, thanks so much for your time today. It looks like the Commission has been quite active over the past few months in its stated commitment to actually investigate potential non-compliance. But before we deal with that, overall, do you think that there's a general understanding and acceptance of where BE legislation stands at the moment?
Thanks for having me on. I think it's getting better. I think it's a new regulatory framework. I think people are still getting an understanding of what the Commission and how they're going to behave, the regulatory definitions, etc. So we've had, codes, acts and charters for some time now, but with the regulator just being introduced, I think it's getting better, but I think there's a ways to go to understand how to interact.
One thing we tend to focus quite a lot on is obviously fronting, that being the most blatant disregard for the legislation itself. Has the Commission been successful in investigating this and actually putting some cases forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was not necessarily fronting specifically. I mean, obviously that is one of the Commission's focus. There were 17 public investigations announced in August of last year. One of, a company's listing on the Nigerian Stock Exchange was one of the listed in there. But some of these are regulatory non-compliance aspects, but not necessarily fronting, which is a sort of a very specific and defined term. So I'm sure we're going to see more of these things come out, and I think it's welcomed by the market.
Which areas are still not fully understood by potential investors?
Yeah, I think potential investors have the Competition Act and Commission and the Takeover Regulation Panel as reference points, and I think what sometimes people are not understanding is that the Commission is operating in a different way. You don't get pre-approval for your transactions. It's a reporting and continual monitoring obligation. And that in and of itself creates uncertainty in investors' minds because they're used to having the transactions quote-unquote rubber stamped. And that's certainly not what's happening here. So we sit with banks, we sit with international investors, and they want to know, are we okay here? And we say, well, there's 3 or 4 different things you can do in your transaction to make sure to decrease the risk of non-compliance. But ultimately, you're not going to get a regulator that tick box your exercise before you go ahead and implement. So I think that's the core issue here, is that guys are struggling to understand the approval mechanism or the lack of it.
Okay, so you can get approved, and then as you're saying, there could potentially still be a monitoring of how you continue to comply with the legislation. There's no time frame attached to, right, you've done the deal, tick, tick, tick this box, move ahead, next person, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't work like that. I mean, I think that there's what we're referring to as a 90-day rule. So large transactions have to be registered with the Commission.
Yeah.
And then there's a 90-day period where the person registering might be obligated by the Commissioner to unwind or seek remedies where they think that it's deficient in certain manners. And people are seeing that 90-day rule as a test. Once it lapses and you haven't heard anything from the Commission, people are seeing that as a tacit approval of your transaction. It isn't. The Commission retains their rights at their own volition to go and investigate or, look at that transaction ad infinitum. So there really is no approval mechanism. You can go for a non-binding before to get an advisory opinion. You can obviously get legal opinions. You can work with advisors. But there's no strict approval process, unlike other regulatory frameworks, which is causing angst in the market. Do you close or resolutive conditions? What happens if we have to unwind? Who pays for those things? And these are all the things that people are asking us on a very regular basis.
What happens in a situation where you've been issued a certificate, for example, a BE certificate by a verification agency, and then that particular verification agency gets into trouble with the Commission? Does that nullify everything?
No, it's a very good question. I think the capacity to invalidate certificates is not something that the Commission has after that 90-day period. the Commission effectively has a court process to follow through. I mean, they can apply arbitration principles. But once you have a verification agent which has issued you a certificate, that is something that you could use in the market. I mean, it's part of your certificate to do business in South Africa. And so, when there's a transaction which has had a certificate placed against it, I think we're still going to work through exactly how the Commission is going to see that. There's obviously going to be rating agents impacts, but the transaction in and of itself and the investors behind that, some of our largest transactions are private equity deals into industrials, and those certificates are critical. So, it is an untested space, and I think the legal fraternity and advisors alike are going to have to work through that. But certainly just from a straight invalidation perspective, we don't think that that's necessarily one of the Commission's powers.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks for your time today. Chris Rayner is an associate at Bravura.